A rotted beehive slides off a flatbed and lands hard in the mud behind an equipment shed at the edge of a valley still holding the last snow of March. The wood is soft with rain. Something inside it rattles. Down the county road, past the dairy fences and the bare orchard rows, a second truck moves slow along the shoulder. Chrome grill. A man behind the wheel who does not look at the road. He looks at the shed. The camera closes on the driveway. A screen door swings open. A girl steps out, 17 years old, notebook already in her hand, breath fogging in the cold. She walks toward the shed. 40 more boxes are waiting. Nobody in the valley understands why. The other truck slows further. The engine idles at the mailbox. A hand rests on the wheel. Behind the shed, something under the mud begins to hum. The first time anyone in Millbrook County noticed Hollis Renner loading a rotted beehive onto the back of her father's flatbed, they figured she was hauling junk to the burn pile. Nobody thought twice about it. Old hive boxes sat behind half the barns in the valley, stacked and forgotten. Some infested with wax moths. Some collapsed from years of rain until the corners had gone soft as wet cardboard. She had asked 3 different farms if she could take theirs off their hands, and every single one had said yes without hesitation, because who in their right mind would want a pile of dead, rotting beehives hauled off a property that had already given up on them? Then she asked a 4th farm, then a 5th. By the time the snow melted off Miller's Ridge that spring, 17-year-old Hollis had collected more than 40 abandoned hives, stacking them in neat rows behind her family's equipment shed, like she was building something the whole town could see, but nobody could explain. The rows started against the north wall and grew outward 1 box a day, sometimes 3, until the shed looked less like storage and more like a monument to a question no one had thought to ask. Her mother, Delphine, watched from the kitchen window one evening while the sun cut long shadows across the yard, and she asked her daughter over dinner what exactly she thought she was doing with a shed full of dead bee boxes. Hollis just held her fork still for a moment, chewed, swallowed. Her voice came out even without defense. "I'm still figuring it out." Then she went back to eating. It wasn't an answer, but it was the only one she gave anyone for a long time, and that silence would come to define the way the valley talked about her for the better part of a year. Millbrook County was the kind of place where everybody's business became everybody's business, whether they liked it or not. It sat in a shallow valley 2 hours from the nearest interstate, ringed by dairy farms, hayfields, and a handful of orchard operations that had been passed down for 3 or 4 generations. The road into town curved through a stretch of woods so thick that outsiders sometimes doubled back, thinking they had missed a turn only to find themselves rounding one last bend into a wide bowl of cleared land where church steeples and grain silos rose against the tree line like the last relics of a slower century. The Renner family ran 40 acres of mixed pasture and row crops. Nothing fancy, the kind of operation that survived on frugality and long hours rather than scale. Hollis's father, Warren, worked the land with the quiet economy of a man who had never known any other rhythm. Her mother taught music at the elementary school in town twice a week and kept the household books on Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table. Ledger's open radio tuned low to a farm report she barely listened to. Hollis had grown up doing chores before school and chores after school, much like most kids in the valley, and she was not the type anyone singled out. Quiet, observant, the sort of teenager who would rather watch how something worked than talk about it. Her grades were fine. Her attendance was fine. Nothing about her screamed ambition, at least not the kind adults recognized, which made it stranger when she started asking around about bees. It began small, a conversation at the feed store with old Harlan Petrie, who used to keep hives decades back before arthritis took the strength out of his hands. Hollis had walked in on a Tuesday afternoon to pick up a bag of scratch grain for her mother's laying flock, and she found Harlan by the register, leaning on a cane he had not needed a year earlier, his fingers curled inward from a lifetime of cold mornings on cold metal. She lingered near the counter longer than she needed to. Then she asked him a question that did not sound like idle curiosity. She asked why a hive might just up and die overnight when everything about it looked healthy the week before. Harlan's eyes came up slow, the way an old man's eyes do when they realize they are being taken seriously by someone under 60. He talked for almost an hour. He talked about ventilation and moisture. He talked about the way a queen's laying pattern could tell you everything you needed to know if you had the patience to read it. He talked about the winter of 1978 when he had lost 11 hives in a single February and driven home from the field so quiet his wife thought someone had died. Hollis pulled a spiral notebook from her jacket pocket and wrote as fast as her pencil would move. And when she left the feed store, she left with the bag of grain forgotten on the counter and half the pages of the notebook filled in a hand that ran uphill at the edges. Then she started collecting. Every farm had its story about why the hives got abandoned. Old man Whitlock's colonies collapsed 2 winters back, and he never had the heart to try again. Said it felt like burying a dog every time he cracked a lid. The Aldrich family lost 3 hives to what the extension office called colony collapse disorder, a mysterious phenomenon in which worker bees simply vanish, leaving behind a queen. Some brood in untouched honey stores and no clear single cause. Some hives had wood rot so deep the boxes came apart in her hands. Some had been torn open by raccoons hunting for larvae, the lids scattered 10 feet across a pasture. All of them were considered worthless. One of the Aldrich boxes turned out to be sound enough to save, and it became one of the first hives Hollis ever brought back to life, proof before she had fully believed it herself that a colony written off as a loss could still have something left to give. Hollis did not think they were worthless. She just did not say why yet. The town noticed the shed filling up before anyone noticed her doing much else. Her best friend, Sawyer Cade, asked her straight out one afternoon while they were fixing fence along the south pasture, breath fogging in the last cold morning of March. "You are not seriously trying to start a bee farm with garbage boxes, are you?" "Working on it," she answered. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." Sawyer let it go, mostly because Hollis had that look she got when she had already made up her mind about something, and talking was not going to change it. He had known her since they were 7 years old, and he knew her expressions the way a farmer knows weather. What nobody knew not yet was that Hollis was chasing an idea she could not fully explain, one taking shape a little at a time in that battered spiral notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. Sketches, measurements, notes copied from library books on apiculture printouts from the county extension office. A list of questions she intended to ask the one man in the valley who might actually know the answers. That man was Emmett Iverson, 74 years old, a retired commercial beekeeper who had once managed close to 200 colonies before his hands gave out, and his wife made him promise to slow down before she was buried by the same land that had already outlasted her patience. Emmett lived alone now on the edge of town in a house surrounded by lilac bushes and rusted equipment, and most kids in the valley were a little afraid of him because he did not suffer fools. He had been known to walk off a porch mid-conversation if someone said something he found tedious. He had been known to close a door on a Sunday visitor before the visitor had finished a sentence. Hollis knew all of that. She went anyway. Before she could get to Emmett's door, though, someone got to hers. Raymond Blackwood pulled his truck into the Renner driveway on a Thursday afternoon in the first real warm week of April, the gravel loud beneath his tires, and he stepped out with the easy weight of a man who knew he was owed a certain amount of respect wherever he arrived. 55 years old, broad through the shoulders, a face that had spent its whole life outdoors. He ran the largest commercial apiary in 3 counties. Something like 300 hives spread across leased pastures from the state line down to the river. He was the kind of man who did not knock so much as announce himself by presence, and Warren Renner, standing in the yard with a wrench in his hand, straightened up the way a man does when he understands the shape of a conversation before it starts. Blackwood smiled the whole time he spoke. That was the part Hollis remembered later. The smile. He had come out just to see how things were going, he said. Heard through the grapevine that young Miss Renner had taken an interest in bees. Fine hobby, he said. Fine hobby for a girl her age. He wanted her to know he had been running pollination contracts in this valley for 15 years now, and the orchard folks up on the ridge and the melon growers down along the bottom, they all knew who to call when bloom time came around, and he was happy to keep it that way, of course. He said it that way. Of course. Then he shifted his weight and looked past Warren toward the shed and its slow-growing wall of dead boxes, and the smile did not move, but something behind it did. A girl her age ought to focus on her studies, he said. Bees will bite the hand that don't know what it's doing. He tipped his cap to Warren and left without ever addressing Hollis directly. And the sound of the truck fading down the drive stayed in the yard longer than the man himself had. Warren watched the road for a long minute after the dust settled. Then he looked at Hollis, who had stepped out onto the porch halfway through and heard every word. His jaw worked once. He did not say anything. He went back to what he had been doing, and the wrench in his hand shook slightly before he steadied it. Hollis went to Emmett Iverson's house that Saturday. She parked her father's old pickup at the curb because his driveway was blocked by a broken-down tractor that looked like it had been broken down for a decade. She walked up the flagstone path through knee-high grass, past a wheelbarrow filled with rainwater, and two rusted honey supers stacked beside the porch. The door opened before she could knock. Emmett stood in the frame, tall and stooped, hair the color of chimney smoke, one hand braced against the jamb because the other did not close properly anymore. He looked at her for what felt like a full 10 seconds without saying anything, and she found herself gripping her notebook against her chest, the way a smaller child grips a school folder on the first day. She got the question out before her nerve went. She asked whether it was possible to bring a dead-out hive back to life using bees from a different, healthier colony. She asked whether the box itself could be salvaged if the wax and comb inside had gone bad. She asked whether there was something the extension office might not know that he did. Emmett looked at her for a long moment before answering. Depends what killed it. Then after another pause during which she thought she might have to leave, sit down. That was the beginning of something neither of them expected. Over the following weeks, Emmett became something between a teacher and a skeptic in residence, testing her, constantly refusing to hand her easy answers, walking her out to the sagging shed behind his house, where he still kept 3 woodenware nukes he had never quite been able to bring himself to throw out. He explained that a hive's health could often be read like a book if you knew what to look for. A tight, consistent brood pattern, eggs and larvae in capped cells laid in a spiral by a well-mated queen that was the mark of a strong colony. A patchy, scattered pattern meant trouble. Failing queen, disease, maybe both. He held up an empty frame in one gnarled hand and turned it so the light caught the fine wax scaffolding, and he told her to memorize what a healthy comb looked like before she ever tried to fix a sick one, because if she did not know good, she would not recognize bad until it was too late. Most of what killed those hives wasn't some big mystery. That was what he told her one afternoon, standing at the truck bed while she loaded a salvaged deep box into the back. It was neglect. Bad ventilation in summer cooks a colony from the inside. Poor insulation in winter starves them out before spring even gets here. People stack a super on top, walk away, wonder why the bees didn't make it. Then he looked at her directly, and his voice dropped a register. Bees don't fail. People fail bees. That line stuck with her more than anything else Emmett said that spring. She wrote it in the top margin of a fresh page in her notebook, then underlined it twice, then closed the notebook and did not open it again until she was home. Meanwhile, at home, something was shifting. Her uncle Bertram Warren's older brother came by on a Sunday after church with his wife trailing behind him carrying a covered dish that no one had asked for. Bertram was a heavy man with a heavy opinion of himself, and he settled into a kitchen chair the way a landlord settles into an inspection. He asked Warren, half serious, half not, whether Hollis needed to see somebody about the bee business. He said it in front of her. He said it while she was standing at the counter slicing tomatoes for lunch, the knife pausing on the cutting board just long enough for her to hear the words, land. Warren, to his credit, did not answer right away. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, Bertram ought to mind his own operation and let him mind his. Bertram laughed the way men laugh when they have been told something they do not intend to accept. And he changed the subject, but the room did not change back with him. Later that night, after the dishes were done, Hollis heard her parents in the kitchen through the thin wall of her bedroom. Her mother's voice was low, worried, edged with the particular kind of tiredness that comes from carrying someone else's decision. Delphine wanted to know what Blackwood had really meant. She wanted to know whether it was true that a man like that could squeeze the hay contract they held with the co-op. She wanted to know why their daughter was the one who had to be the one. Why not next year? Why not later? Warren said very little. He said Hollis was doing something she cared about, and there had not been many things she had cared about like this, and he was not going to be the man who took that away from her. Delphine's voice cracked once. She said she was not asking him to take it away. She was asking him whether he had thought about what it would cost. Warren did not answer that. The kitchen went quiet. A chair scraped. The refrigerator hummed. Hollis lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and made a list in her head of everything she still needed to learn before summer, and she did not sleep until nearly 2. She started small in the way Emmett insisted she start. 3 of the sturdiest salvaged hives. 3 sets of new frames she paid for out of the money she had earned last summer, working the produce stand at the roadside farm north of town. Nucleus colonies purchased from a supplier 2 counties over small starter colonies, known as nukes each, with a young mated queen and a handful of frames already drawn with comb wrapped in wire mesh and delivered from the back of a stranger's van at a gas station off the state route. She loaded them into her truck bed while a light rain hit the metal, and she drove home 10 miles under the speed limit because the sound of the bees in the boxes behind her felt like carrying something more delicate than eggs. She patched the rotted wood on the salvaged boxes with scraps from her father's barn, replaced frames destroyed by wax moths, scorched the interior of every reused box with a propane torch to sanitize what she could not see. Emmett swore by that torch. He said any old box with an uncertain history got the flame before it got the bees, no exceptions, because a spore that lived through a cold winter would live through a summer of good intentions too. She did it on a windless morning, with the boxes lined up on sawhorses and the smell of scorched pine hung in the yard for hours after. By the end of the first week of May, the 3 revived hives were installed on stands she had built from cinder blocks and pressure-treated lumber, spaced out along the sunny south edge of the equipment shed where the morning light would warm them early. She painted the boxes a pale cream color rather than the traditional white because Emmett had told her white was fine, but light reflective mattered more than tradition when a heat wave came through in July. She stood back and looked at them the first evening, 3 squat little cream boxes humming faintly against the sunset, and she felt something in her chest she did not have a word for. Then she tried to requeen the first salvage colony, and everything went wrong. The colony had come with a laying queen when she caught the swarm off the fence post at the Whitlock place. But the queen had been visibly old, her thorax bald in patches, her abdomen thin. Emmett had told her from the first inspection that this queen would need to be replaced before the fall. Hollis had ordered a new mated queen from the same supplier, a young Italian, and when the small wooden cage arrived in the mail with 3 attendant workers clinging to the wire mesh, she felt so ready. So sure. She had read the process a dozen times. The cage would go into the colony with a candy plug sealing one end. The workers inside would eat through the candy over several days, and by the time they broke through, the pheromone scent of the new queen would have spread through the colony, and the workers would accept her as their own. But Hollis broke the plug herself. She did not mean to exactly. She had been checking the cage on the 3rd afternoon, and she noticed the candy was harder than she expected, and she worried it would take a whole week rather than 3 days, and she thought just this once she could give things a small push. She pried a corner of the plug loose with the tip of a hive tool. The new queen walked out into the colony on her own. The bees killed her within a day. Hollis found the queen the next morning crumpled and small at the bottom of the entrance, and she picked her up with a piece of index card and stood there for a long moment before she could move. There was no drama in the yard, just the ordinary morning sound of birds and a distant tractor and the low hum of the 2 remaining colonies going about their work. But something inside her had gone still in a way that felt terrible and clarifying at the same time. She drove to Emmett's that evening with the queen in a small jar on the passenger seat. Emmett did not shout. He did not need to. He looked at the jar. He looked at her. Then he said what he had said before in different words. You rushed it. Bees don't care how excited you are. You cage her. You let them get used to her smell over several days. Then you let her out. Every time. Hollis nodded. Her jaw was tight. He softened, but only a fraction. He told her the mistake was normal. He told her that everyone who had ever kept bees had killed a queen through impatience at least once, and the ones who claimed otherwise were lying. But then he said something she wrote down later. He said patience with bees is patience with yourself. Then he went inside to make coffee and left her standing on the porch with a jar in her lap and a wet spot at the corner of one eye she wiped away before he came back out. She drove home slower than she had driven out. It rained hard that week. She stayed inside with the notebook and rewrote everything she thought she had known about her plan. She rewrote her introduction schedule to space out queen editions by 7 days instead of 3. She wrote a page titled Things I Have Done Wrong and filled it. Then she wrote a page titled Things I Still Do Not Know and filled that too. When she was finished, the second page was longer. Warren knocked on her doorframe on the 3rd rainy evening. He carried a mug of tea in one hand and stood there for a moment looking at the walls of her room like he had not been in there in a while, which was probably true. He set the tea down on her desk. He said her uncle had been by the co-op that morning. He said Bertram had made it known loud enough for a certain party to hear that the Renner family did not necessarily support what their daughter was doing behind the shed. He said Blackwood had smiled when he heard it. That was the word Warren used. Smiled. Hollis looked at her father. She could see in the way he was standing that he had rehearsed this conversation on the drive home. She could see he did not want to have it. He said, "If you don't have something real to show by the middle of summer, I don't know that I can keep the shed the way it is." He said it gently. He was not threatening. He was informing. She asked what he meant by real. He said he did not exactly know. Bees that lived, bees that made honey, bees that did something the whole valley could see and not laugh at. He said he was proud of her for trying. He said he was tired of watching people look at his family like his daughter had lost her mind. He said, "I need you to give me something I can point to. I don't have to understand it. I just have to be able to point to it." Then he left the room. The mug of tea sat on her desk, untouched until it went cold. And when she poured it down the sink at midnight, the ceramic was heavier in her hand than it had any right to be. She went back to Emmett the next morning. She showed him her notebook. All of it. The pages of failures, the pages of unanswered questions, the new introduction schedule she had rewritten twice. He read for a long time in silence, thumbing through the pages the way a preacher thumbs through a Bible on a Saturday night looking for the passage he needs on Sunday. When he closed the notebook, he handed it back to her. He said the plan was decent. He said the patience she had written on page 14 was the whole game. Then he told her he would help her requeen the second colony that afternoon, and this time he would stand behind her the whole way and not touch a thing, because she needed to be the one who did it right the first time she did it right. They caged the queen at 3 in the afternoon. They set the cage between two brood frames. They closed the hive. Hollis did not check it the next day. She did not check it the day after. On the fourth day, she opened the box and lifted the cage and found the queen already released, already moving among the workers, already being groomed by them the way a colony grooms its own. She was accepted. She was laying by the end of the week. Something shifted in Hollis after that afternoon. Not in a way anyone else would have noticed. She still moved quietly through the world. She still did chores without complaint. She still ate dinner with her family and answered her mother's questions in the same short, honest sentences. But the notebook stopped being a diary of things she did not know and started being a plan of things she could do. By the middle of May, the 3 revived hives were humming at full strength. She learned to read the sound of a healthy colony, a steady, low hum that changed pitch if something was wrong. She learned to recognize the peanut-shaped structure of a swarm cell built on the bottom edge of a frame when the bees intended to raise a new queen and split the colony, and she learned that catching that early could mean the difference between keeping her bees or watching half of them fly off into the woods to a hollow tree she would never find. She learned about nectar flow, the seasonal windows, when flowering plants produce enough nectar for bees to build real honey surplus. She started mapping where the valley's best forage grew. Clover fields along the county road, wild blackberry thickets across the fence line on the Petrie property, where Harlan still walked most mornings just to see what the day looked like. A stand of basswood trees nobody paid attention to, but bees apparently loved, on a south-facing slope behind the abandoned schoolhouse at the end of Maple Grove. She was learning the entire ecosystem of the valley through the perspective of a creature most people ignored, and it was rearranging how she saw the land she had grown up on. The pasture she had crossed 1,000 times to feed the calves was not just pasture anymore. It was a nectar map. The hedgerow her father complained about every spring was a windbreak that kept a foraging trail open on cold mornings. The dead limbs on the old maple by the driveway were where a wild colony had once lived, and if she stood beneath it at sunset in the right week of June, she could still see honeybees flying in and out of a knothole 20 feet up. She wrote all of it in the notebook. She was building a map that only she could read. Word got around the way it always did. Some of it was not kind. A few of the older farmers joked at the co-op that the Renner girl had lost her mind messing with bees when there were real chores to do. One of the deacons at the Baptist church made a comment during coffee hour about how young people these days confused hobbies with vocations, and Delphine, who happened to be near the coffee urn, poured her cup so slowly and set it down so carefully that the deacon changed the subject on his own. Blackwood, for his part, did not come back to the driveway. He did not have to. His voice moved through the valley the way weather moved through it everywhere at once present, even when the sky looked clear. But not everyone was dismissive. Mrs. Theolander, who ran the elementary school garden club and had known Hollis since kindergarten, started asking questions when she saw the girl hauling frames through town. Harlan Petrie began stopping by the Renner place just to look at the hive standing at a respectful distance and nodding like he approved of something he could not quite name. He never asked to touch anything. He never offered advice. He just stood at the corner of the shed with his cane and watched, and once or twice, Hollis caught him smiling in a way that suggested he had been remembering something private. Sawyer started helping on weekends. He got stung often enough that he stopped complaining about the smell of the smoker. He got stung on the ear one Saturday and drove home with a swelling the size of a plum, and when his mother asked what happened, he only said he had been helping Hollis and left it at that. The 3 colonies became 4 when Hollis split the strongest one in early June. She caught the moment right. She had gone into the hive on a warm afternoon and lifted a frame and seen 4 capped swarm cells hanging from the bottom edge like small elongated fingers, and she had known in the way she was learning to know things that the colony was preparing to leave. She had 2 hours, maybe 3. She moved the old queen and half the frames into a fresh box on a new stand 10 feet away. She left the swarm cells with the original colony. She closed both boxes and stepped back and watched the returning foragers sort themselves out between the 2 entrances over the course of the afternoon. Emmett came by that evening to see the split. He walked around both hives twice. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said she had done it right. He said it the way a man like him said things like that, briefly, without inflection, as if he were reading a fact off a clipboard. But she heard it. She heard it, and she wrote it in the notebook that night, not as praise but as a fact she wanted to preserve, because she was starting to understand that Emmett's praise was rarer and more valuable than most people's affection. Then, in the 3rd week of June, something happened that nearly broke everything. Hollis went out to the yard one morning and found a boot print in the mud beside the north row of hives. Not her boot, not her father's. A boot print she did not recognize, larger, wider pressed deep enough to hold water from the previous night's rain. She followed the prints along the row. They stopped in front of one hive. The lid had been slightly askew, not enough for the bees to notice, not enough for a passing eye to notice. But she had set every lid herself, and she knew the angle of every one. She lifted the lid carefully. Everything looked in place. Frames in order. Bees calm. She counted them by feel by the weight of the frames when she pulled one and set it back. But something in her chest had gone cold. Someone had been out here. Someone had opened her hive in the night. She did not tell her father. She did not tell Emmett. She did not tell Sawyer. She stood in the yard with the boot print filling with dew, and she made a decision she did not name yet. She would watch. She would not accuse. She would keep working. But she would know from now on that whatever she was building had someone else's attention, and that attention was not friendly. She spent that afternoon reinforcing her stands. She replaced 2 ratchet straps with heavier ones. She set a small solar-powered motion light at the corner of the shed where the beam would sweep across the north row if anything moved after dark. It was a modest defense. It was probably not enough. But it was the shape of an answer to a question that had not been asked out loud yet, and she felt better having done it. By the end of June, the 4 colonies had become 6 through a second careful split, and Emmett had begun to bring her small gifts of equipment he no longer needed. An old smoker with a bent bellows, she straightened over the vise in the barn. A stack of unused inner covers he had bought decades ago and forgotten in the loft. A queen excluder still in its original wrapper yellowed at the corners. He never made a fuss when he brought these things. He set them down at the edge of the porch and mentioned them in passing. She thanked him by keeping her hives cleaner than she had the week before. One afternoon in late June, while Hollis was replacing a frame in the 3rd hive, Warren came out of the house and stood for a while watching. He had not spent this much time near the bees before. He watched her hands. He watched the smooth rhythm of the smoker, puffs the careful way she scraped propolis from the top bars with the edge of her hive tool, the slow lifting of frames one at a time, tilted just enough to catch the light without dropping bees to the ground. He did not say anything for almost 20 minutes. Then he said, "You're good at this." She looked up. She had not expected to hear that in his voice. She had heard many things in her father's voice over the years: tiredness, patience, frustration, care. But not this particular thing, which was quieter than pride and closer to surprise. She said she had been practicing. He nodded. He watched her close the hive. He said, "Whatever your uncle has to say about it, I want you to know something. I am watching what you're doing. I am watching how you are doing it." Then he cleared his throat and walked back to the barn, and neither of them mentioned the conversation again. But she kept it. She kept it the way she kept the good frames, the ones with perfect brood pattern. She pulled out to show Emmett as proof of what a colony could be when it was healthy. The deadline her father had implied did not go away. Middle of summer meant something specific in his mind, and Hollis felt the pressure of it building in her chest as June turned into July. She had 6 hives now. That was something. But 6 hives were not proof. 6 hives could be an accident or a coincidence or a beginner's luck story that would fall apart the moment weather turned. She needed the hives to survive something. She needed them to prove they were not just alive, but resilient, because in a valley like Millbrook, alive was ordinary and resilient was rare, and only rare things earned the right to change how anyone thought. She did not know yet what would come. She did not know the heat wave was coming. She did not know how bad the summer would get, how fast, how completely. But she knew she was ready in a way she had not been in the spring. She had killed a queen through impatience and replaced her through patience. She had learned to read a sound. She had learned to read a comb. She had built stands from scrap lumber and painted her boxes a color no one else in the valley used. And she had done all of it while a man with 300 hives and a smile, like a locked gate, had let his voice run through her town about her. On the last evening of June, she stood in the yard as the sun went down and looked at the 6 hives lined along the south wall of the shed. The light coming off the cream-colored boxes was pale gold in the low sun. She could hear the hum from 10 feet away, steady low, the sound of colonies settling for the night. She thought about her father's face when he had told her she was good at this. She thought about the boot print in the mud. She thought about Emmett standing in his doorway that first Saturday morning telling her to sit down. Her mother stepped out onto the porch behind her and called that dinner was on the table. Hollis did not answer right away. She stayed a moment longer. She watched the last of the foragers coming home in the low light. She thought about what she was going to write in the notebook that night. Then she turned toward the house. The sky the next morning was clear. The forecast on the radio said the temperature would hit the mid-90s by the weekend. The forecast said it would stay there. That was the beginning of the heat. The heat came in slow at first, the way heat always comes to a valley like Millbrook, 1 degree above normal, on Monday 2, on Tuesday 3, by Wednesday afternoon. The radio kept saying it would break by the weekend. It did not break by the weekend. By Sunday morning, the thermometer on the north wall of the equipment shed read 96 by 10 in the morning, and Hollis was already out there with a garden sprayer, misting the shaded ground around the hive stands to raise the humidity in the immediate air the foragers were passing through. She had been preparing for this since the first week of June without knowing it. Every choice she had made in the spring was now being tested by a sun that did not blink. The pale cream paint she had chosen against the traditional white. The extra ventilation gap she had cut into the top of every inner cover with a small handsaw at Emmett's kitchen table one Saturday. The way she had positioned each stand so the morning sun warmed the entrance early, but the afternoon sun fell on the back wall of the shed instead of the boxes themselves. Small choices, cheap choices. The kind of choices that looked pointless in April when the ground was still cold enough to freeze a boot print overnight, but which now, in the 5th day of a heat wave that had not been forecast to last this long, were the only thing standing between 6 colonies and 6 coffins. Sawyer came over that Monday because he had heard the forecast on his father's radio, and he showed up in the driveway with 2 5-gallon jugs of water in the back of his truck. He did not ask if she needed them. He set them down beside the shed. Then he took the second sprayer off her porch and started working the row from the opposite end. They did not talk much. There was not much to say. The bees were bearding heavily on the front of every hive, hanging in great living clumps outside the entrances to reduce the internal temperature by their own absence, the queens and the brood cool inside, while the workers cooked outside in a slow rotation. It looked wrong to a person who did not know what they were seeing. It looked like the colony was dying. Hollis had spent an hour on the phone with Emmett the night before to make sure she was not going to panic and do something stupid. 2 miles up the county road at the Aldrich place, 3 of the 4 hives that neighbor had rebuilt the previous summer were failing. Hollis did not know it until Wednesday when the Aldrich boy came by on his bicycle to ask if she could come look. His mother had sent him. His father was in the field. The colonies were listless, the boy said, and there were dead bees piling up on the landing boards in numbers he had never seen. Hollis drove over that afternoon. The moment she walked up to the first hive, she understood. The boxes had been placed in full southern sun against the south wall of a metal-sided pole barn, and the wall was radiating heat into the boxes from behind. The lids were dark green, absorbing everything the sun threw at them. There was no ventilation gap in the inner covers. The entrances were the standard reducer size for summer, which was fine in most summers, but which was strangling airflow now. It was not one problem. It was five problems stacked on top of each other. She told Mrs. Aldrich what she was seeing gently without making the woman feel worse than she already did. She helped move all four hives to a shaded corner of the yard beneath the elm tree by the barn. She widened the entrances with a pocket knife. She showed the Aldrich boy how to set up a slow-drip water source 10 feet from the hives to reduce foraging travel for water on the worst days. Two of the four colonies survived. Two did not. The two that died had been too far gone by the time she arrived. Mrs. Aldrich cried a little in the driveway when Hollis was leaving, not for the bees exactly, but for the accumulation of small failures that had brought her family to a place where they needed a 17-year-old girl to explain what had gone wrong. Hollis drove home slower than she needed to. She did not feel proud of what she had done. She only felt tired in a way that was new to her, the specific tiredness of understanding a problem too late to fix all of it. The heat wave broke the following Tuesday, 12 days after it had started, and when Hollis went out to inspect her own 6 colonies on Wednesday morning, every single one was intact. Not a single loss. Not even weakened populations. The brood patterns held. The queens were still laying. The foragers were still going out. Emmett came by that afternoon on his own accord, which he almost never did, and he walked the row twice, and he stood at the end with his cane resting against the shed, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I've been at this for 56 years. I lost hives to heat in 78. I lost hives to heat in 94. I lost hives to heat every summer of the last decade. What you just did, most of the men I know couldn't have done." Then he stopped talking, because that was more than he had said in a single stretch in years. Hollis did not know how to receive it. She looked at the ground. She said, "Thank you." He waved a hand as if to dismiss the moment before it became something. He drove home. Word did not travel about the Aldrich save at first. Mrs. Aldrich was not the kind of woman who advertised her failures. But it traveled about Raymond Blackwood's operation. He had lost close to 30 hives during the heat wave. Nobody in the valley had a full count. It was more than the sort of loss a commercial operation could hide. 2 of his leased pastures had turned into cemeteries in the space of a week. His trucks came out to haul the boxes away on the following Friday, and every car that passed him on the county road counted the loads. In a valley like Millbrook, that kind of counting became a kind of story before anyone had said a word out loud. Blackwood did not stay quiet for long. The rumor started at the farmer's market on the first Saturday of August. Hollis was there with a folding table and 8 jars of honey she had extracted from her strongest hive, the previous week's small first-cut mason jars, with a hand-lettered label her mother had helped her design. She had a slow morning. A few of her regulars stopped by. A woman she did not know bought 2 jars for a gift. Sawyer's mother came over and squeezed her shoulder without buying anything, which was its own kind of purchase. Around 10 in the morning, Hollis noticed that traffic to her table had gone thin in a way that did not match the crowd in the aisles. People were walking past, not stopping. Some of them were looking at her table and then looking away in a particular kind of pretend not looking that only happens when everyone has been told the same thing. She found out what the thing was from Mrs. Theolander, who came by around 11 with her jaw set. She told Hollis plainly that Raymond Blackwood had been telling anyone at the melon grower's booth that the young Renner girls' colonies were showing signs of American foul brood, that her rebuilt boxes from unknown farms were a spore risk, that any honey coming off those hives ought to be tested before it was sold. He had not said any of it as fact. He had said it as concern. He had said it with that same smile. Hollis did not answer for a moment. She sat down on the metal folding chair behind her table. She looked at the jars. She thought about the 2 Aldrich hives she had failed to save. She thought about the boot print in the mud a month back. She thought about the fact that everything she had done since March had been built on the assumption that quality would eventually be its own answer. She understood sitting there in the July heat with a fly buzzing above one of the jars that quality was not going to be enough by itself. She was going to have to fight for it. She packed up her table at noon. She had sold 3 jars. She drove to Emmett's house before she went home. He was on the porch shelling peas into a metal bowl, and she stood at the bottom of the steps and told him what Blackwood had said. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he set the bowl down beside his chair. He said, "We test tomorrow, every single hive. If we're clean, we're going to be clean loudly." Then he went inside to call the county extension office to schedule the inspection himself. The inspection came on the second Monday of August. The county extension agent was a thin, careful man named Denton Rhodes, mid-40s, with the mild manner of someone who had learned early in his career that farmers listened better to a quiet voice than a loud one. Emmett had known him for 2 decades. Rhodes brought a field test kit for American foul brood, the kind that used a wooden matchstick to lift ropey larval residue from suspect cells, and he brought a laboratory sampling container in case anything looked ambiguous enough to warrant a lab confirmation. He went through every one of Hollis's 6 hives with her at his elbow. He tested a suspect-looking cell in the third hive 1, where a capped cell had a small pinhole in it that could mean any of a dozen things. The matchstick came out clean. He tested cells in every other hive as a matter of protocol. All clean. He wrote his findings on a clipboard while standing in the sun, and he told Hollis and Emmett standing behind her that in 23 years of doing this job, he had never seen a beginner's yard as tightly kept as hers. He said it flatly without flourish, which meant more than a flourish would have. Then he did something Hollis did not expect. He said that he had heard the rumor. He did not say from where. He said that as an extension agent, it was not his place to argue with a private citizen's concerns, but he could put in writing that these hives were clean. He said that piece of paper travels faster than the rumor does if you take it to the right doors. Hollis took it to the right doors. She spent the following Wednesday driving from one small orchard operation to the next, from the Whitlock place to the DeWeiler place to the small stand of peach trees at the far end of the valley owned by a widow named Mrs. Caraway. She did not go to the big commercial customers Blackwood held under contract. She went to the marginal customers, the small farms, the ones who had been quietly written off by big operations because their acreage did not justify a full pollination package. She handed each of them a copy of the extension report. She did not badmouth Blackwood. She did not even mention his name. She just said, "If you'd ever want honeybees on your bloom next spring, I'm keeping a list." Then she said, "Thank you." Then she left. Mrs. Caraway held the report in her hand for a long time after Hollis left the yard. Later, she would tell her sister at the church potluck that she had never had a young person come to her door and ask her a business question in a voice that steady, and that she had put Hollis's name at the top of the list she kept beside her phone. Sales did not come back at the market immediately, but they came back, slow, steady. By the third weekend of August, Hollis was selling out her Saturday inventory by noon. Meanwhile, the 6 hives had become 9. She had split 2 more colonies during the last week of July, and she had reclaimed the second of the salvage boxes that had come from the Whitlock property in April, the one she had held back as a project box, rebuilding its bottom board from cedar scraps and fitting it with a new inner cover of her own design. It was the ugliest hive in the row. The paint was uneven where she had touched up damage. One corner had a wood putty patch that had not sanded flush. She had populated it with a small cluster she had captured off a low fence post at the edge of the north pasture in mid-June, a natural swarm that had drifted onto Renner land from somewhere she could not identify, and she had watched the cluster settle and start drawing comb with a speed that surprised her. The queen in that hive had come with the swarm. Older than Hollis realized at first. She had spent the summer laying steadily but not aggressively, and the population had grown but not fast enough. Then in the first week of August, the pattern started to shift. The queen was slowing. Hollis noticed it on a Tuesday morning. The brood frame she pulled that day had a shotgun pattern, brood cells scattered across the comb with empty cells between them, the tight spiral of a healthy pattern gone. Some of the capped cells had sunken slightly. A few had small perforations at the center of the caps. She stood there in the yard with the frame in her hands, and the memory of Blackwood's rumor came back to her in the same moment as the memory of Denton Rhodes lifting a matchstick out of a cell and holding it up to the sun. Her stomach dropped. She wrapped the frame in a damp dish towel from the kitchen. She drove to Emmett's with her hands tight on the steering wheel. Emmett was inside watching the noon news. He did not comment when she came through the door with the frame. He took it, set it on the kitchen table, moved his lamp closer and bent over it with a magnifying glass in one hand. He looked at it for what felt like a very long time. He said, "Could be a few things." Then he did not say the thing she was afraid he would say. He said, "Could be a failing queen running out of stored sperm. Could be a queen not laying enough workers because the population isn't right yet. Could be a nutritional problem. Or, and here his voice took on a specific weight, could be foul brood." Then he added, "And if it's that, we're not saving this colony. We're burning the box before it spreads to every hive you have. Hollis's throat closed. She did not answer for a moment. She thought about the roads report in her folder at home. She thought about Blackwood's smile. She thought about her father saying, "I need you to give me something I can point to." She thought about the fact that if she had to burn a hive on her own property in view of the county road, the fire would travel through the valley faster than any report. Emmett looked at her face. He said, "We're going to test it before we do anything." He got the field test kit off the top of his refrigerator, the one Rhodes had left him after the inspection, along with a spare he kept for his own peace of mind. He said, "And if the test is clean, we're going to keep going. If the test isn't clean, we're going to do it right. You are not going to panic." He walked her through the test himself. She held the frame still. He lifted a suspect cell with the matchstick, drew it up slowly, watched for the characteristic ropey string that would indicate the bacterial infection. The matchstick came up clean. He tested 3 more cells. Clean. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Emmett sat down. His hands were shaking slightly, which surprised her. He looked at the frame. He looked at her. He said, "This is the part nobody tells you when they picture beekeeping. It's not really about the bees most days. It's about noticing things early enough to still fix them." He looked at her again. He said, "You noticed early. That's what matters right now." Then he told her what he thought was actually going on, which was a queen entering the tail end of her productive life, likely 2 to 3 years old, running out of viable sperm from her mating flight, and starting to produce a mix of drones from unfertilized eggs and irregular worker brood. The colony would keep going for a while, but the population would slowly collapse if she was not replaced. He said, "We're going to re-queen her this week, and this time you're going to do it perfectly because you already know how." Hollis did not tell anyone else about the scare. Not her father, not her mother, not Sawyer. She did not want the rumor of what she had almost had to become its own rumor. She ordered a new queen from the supplier that afternoon. It arrived by Thursday. She caged it between 2 brood frames in the affected hive on Thursday evening. She did not check the cage on Friday. She did not check it on Saturday. On Sunday morning, she opened the box and the new queen had already been released by the workers eating through the candy plug, and she was moving between the frames with the deliberate slow walk of a queen being accepted rather than a queen being investigated. 10 days later, the brood pattern had tightened back into the tight spiral of a healthy colony. The population was rebounding. The workers were bringing pollen back in loaded baskets on their hind legs. The hive was going to live. Hollis wrote in her notebook that night. She wrote, "A thriving hive is not a finished project. It is something you have to keep watching season after season, the same way you watch over anything alive and worth keeping." Then she closed the notebook and she sat at her desk for a long time, and she did not sleep until after midnight. By the middle of August, she had expanded to 12 working colonies, 3 more splits taken during the last window before the fall population buildup. The equipment shed row had grown from 3 hives in May to 12 in August, and the sound of it in the mornings was different from anything the Renner property had ever produced. Warren would walk out to the barn at first light for chores, and he would stop for a moment on the porch to listen, and he would go back inside sometimes to tell Delphine that the hum out there was something else, something. He never finished the sentence. He did not have a word for it, but he stopped calling it the bee business the way he had in the spring and started calling it the yard, which was what Hollis called it and what Emmett called it and what beekeepers everywhere called their apiaries when they were speaking of them as places with names. 2 things happened at the end of August that would change the shape of everything. The first was the honey extraction. Hollis had held off harvesting through the summer to let her colonies build strong stores for their first winter. But by the last week of August, 3 of her hives had built enough surplus that she could safely take a small harvest without weakening them for cold weather. She loaded her strongest supers into the truck one Saturday morning and drove them to Emmett's, where he still kept a hand crank extractor he had used commercially for decades. It sat on a workbench in his old honey house, a small building at the back of his property that had not been used for its intended purpose in 8 years, but which still smelled faintly of beeswax and propolis, and the particular fermentation of nectar as it became honey. They worked from noon until after dark. She uncapped the frames with a heated knife Emmett had shown her how to use without cutting herself. She loaded the frames into the extractor drum. She turned the crank at a steady rhythm, watching the honey spin free of the comb and pool at the bottom of the tank, watching it drain slowly through a stainless sieve into a 5-gallon bucket. The color surprised her. It was pale gold, almost water white in the summer light, through the honey house window, lighter than any honey she had ever seen at the farmer's market. Emmett told her it was because most of her forage this summer had been basswood and clover, both of which produced a lighter honey than the goldenrod that would come in the fall. He said you got a summer harvest and a fall harvest coming this year. Most first-year keepers only get one. Then he did not comment further, but she saw him look at the bucket a second time. She jarred it that night at the Renner kitchen table, her mother helping her label each jar, her father coming in from the barn to look at what she had made. Warren picked up one of the jars and held it against the kitchen light. The honey glowed. He set it down slowly. He said, "I have not seen honey this pretty in a while." Then he went back to what he had been doing, but she saw him touch the top of the jar with his fingertips before he left the kitchen, the way a man might touch the top of a child's head without meaning to. She sold 140 jars at the farmer's market over the following 3 Saturdays. She sold 20 more from a small folding table she set up in front of the feed store one Wednesday afternoon at Harlan Petrie's suggestion. She sold 6 directly out of her mother's kitchen to friends of Delphine's who had heard through the school. It was not a fortune. It was $380 of pre-tax income, most of which she put back into equipment for the fall. But it was money that had come out of the ground of the valley made by bees she had brought back from a burn pile, and the meaning of it exceeded the number by an amount she could not have quantified. The second thing that happened at the end of August was the visit from Silas DeWeiler. The DeWeilers had owned the largest orchard operation in the valley for 4 generations. 60 acres of apple and pear trees stretched along the south slope above the creekland that had been in the family since before the town had a name. Silas was 65 now, weathered, taciturn, the kind of man who wore the same denim jacket in April and October and did not seem to notice the difference in temperature. He had once kept his own bees. 20 years back, he had run 12 hives at the corner of the orchard that pollinated his own bloom without contract. Then he had lost 8 of them in a bad winter, then 2 more the following summer to what he suspected was pesticide drift from a neighboring farm, then the last 2 to a combination of neglect and grief, and he had walked away from beekeeping in a way that had not been public but had been permanent. Since then, he had been a customer of Raymond Blackwood's for pollination services, paying more each year for less consistent results, watching his fruit set decline in a way that everyone in the valley had noticed but nobody had explained. He drove into the Renner yard on the last Wednesday of August late in the afternoon, when the light was starting to slant sideways across the shed and the bees were coming home in the thousands. He parked his truck. He did not get out immediately. He sat behind the wheel with the engine off for almost a full minute, looking at the row of hives. Then he got out. Warren was in the yard. Hollis was inside washing extractor equipment at the kitchen sink. Warren met Silas halfway across the driveway. They shook hands. They had known each other since childhood, but had not had a conversation in more than a year. Silas asked if the girl was around. Warren said she was. Warren went inside and told Hollis that Silas DeWeiler was in the yard and wanted to speak with her. She dried her hands on a dish towel and came out. Silas was standing at the edge of the equipment shed, looking at the 3rd hive down the row. He did not turn when she approached. He said without preamble, "My orchard's fruit set has been declining for 8 years. I have been paying Raymond Blackwood more each spring for less each fall. My father would have fired him the first year. I am softer than my father was." Then he turned and looked at her. He said, "Could your bees pollinate my bloom next spring?" Hollis did not answer right away. She looked at the row of hives. She counted in her head what she thought she could grow to by the following April, with careful winter management and early spring splits. She thought about what Emmett would say. She thought about what her father would say. She thought about Raymond Blackwood, who was almost certainly going to hear about this conversation before the week was out. She said yes. Silas nodded once. He did not smile. He was not a man who smiled easily, and he was not going to start now. But something in his shoulders shifted, a small release of tension he had probably been carrying since he had left his driveway that afternoon. He said, "Then we should talk about a contract. Not now. In the fall, when you know what you're going to have to work with in the spring." He said, "I am not going to string you along. If you can put strong hives in my orchard by the first week of bloom, I will pay you fair market for the work. I will not compare you to what Blackwood was charging me because I do not want your price set by his price. I want it set by what a fair contract looks like." He looked at her one more time. He said, "My grandfather kept bees for his own bloom." He would have liked seeing this. Then he shook her hand once briefly, walked back to his truck, and drove out of the yard without further ceremony. Hollis stood in the driveway for a moment after his truck was gone. She did not move. Her father came out of the barn. He had heard part of the conversation from inside. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. He said, "What did I just watch happen?" She said, "I think we just got asked to pollinate Deweiler Orchard." Warren did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "Well." He said it in the tone of a man who has just watched a fence post he had assumed was rotten turn out to be solid enough to lean on. He said, "Well." That night, Delphine and Warren did not go to bed at their usual hour. Hollis heard them talking in the kitchen through her wall, the way she had heard them talking on that April night when her mother had asked her father what the bees would cost. This time the tone was different. Not lighter exactly. Still weighted, but different. Delphine was asking Warren what the winter would look like if the orchard contract came through. Warren was telling her slowly that he did not know yet, but he thought his daughter might have found a way to do something none of them had expected. Delphine said she is 17 years old. Warren said, "I know how old she is. I was there." Then they both laughed quietly, briefly, the way parents laugh late at night about things that are still frightening, but which contain the beginning of relief. The next morning, Hollis went out to the yard at first light. She walked the row. She listened to the hum. She stood in front of the third hive, the one Silas had been looking at when she came out of the house the day before, and she put her hand flat against the side of the box just below the entrance. The wood was warm from the internal heat of the colony. She could feel the vibration of thousands of wings through her palm. She stood that way for a long time. Later that week, Emmett came by. She told him about the Deweiler conversation. He listened without expression. When she was finished, he said, "He came to you." Not Blackwood. He came to you. Then he said, "That is worth something you don't understand yet." She asked what he meant. He said, "In this valley, a man like Silas Deweiler making a decision to leave a contract he has held for years, that decision took him a decade of quiet watching to make. What you are seeing is only the last week of a much longer conversation he has been having with himself." Then he did not elaborate further, but she understood him well enough to write it down that night. Blackwood found out about the Deweiler conversation by the first week of September. Hollis did not know exactly how. Someone must have talked at the diner or at the feed store or at the co-op counter. It did not matter. What mattered was that on a Friday afternoon in the second week of September, his truck came up the county road toward the Renner driveway, and this time he did not turn in. He slowed as he passed the property. He looked directly at the equipment shed and the row of hives visible from the road. Then he accelerated and drove on. Hollis was in the yard. She watched him pass. She did not move. She did not wave. She did not put her head down. She stood in front of the first hive, and she watched his truck disappear around the bend, past the mailbox, and she went back to what she had been doing, which was checking the entrance reducer on the fourth hive for the coming cool nights. That night at dinner, her father said he drove past today. Hollis said, "I saw." Warren said he wanted you to see him. Hollis said, "I know." Warren said, "Don't give him what he wants." She looked at her father. She said, "I'm not planning to." Warren nodded. He went back to his dinner. Delphine at the other end of the table did not comment, but Hollis saw her mother's shoulders soften slightly, the way a woman's shoulders soften when the man she has married says the right thing at the right time without having to be asked. The middle of September brought the first cool nights. Hollis began her fall preparation earlier than most keepers would have based on Emmett's warning that in the valley an early frost could catch a colony that had not finished packing away its winter stores. She checked every hive for honey weight by lifting the back of each box slightly and estimating by feel whether the box was heavy enough to see the colony through until early April. 3 of her 12 hives were light. She fed them sugar syrup in top feeders for 2 weeks, letting the workers convert it into stored calories against the coming cold. The other 9 were already at target weight, which surprised her. It surprised Emmett more. He walked the row with her on a Saturday morning in late September and stopped at each hive to weigh it by heft. When he was done, he said, "You might get all 12 through winter." Then he said, "Don't count on it." Then he said, "But you might." He said it 3 times in 3 different tones, and she understood that he was doing a thing he had probably not done in 20 years, which was letting himself believe in the outcome of a young beekeeper's first year. She did not think about winter yet, not directly. She thought about what her hives would look like in April. She thought about the 8 strongest colonies she would need to move to the Deweiler orchard when the bloom began. She thought about the contract Silas had said they would discuss in the fall, and about how she would price it, and about whether she was ready to sign her name to something that would put her on paper for the first time, as a person doing business rather than a girl with a hobby. She thought about her Uncle Bertram, who had not been by the house since June. She thought about Raymond Blackwood driving past the property with his eyes fixed on the shed. She thought about the boot print in the mud she had never mentioned to anyone, and the motion light she still checked every morning before she opened the hives. She thought about the fact that whatever was going to come at her from those two men, it was not going to come as a shout. It was going to come as a whisper, and she was going to have to learn to hear a whisper before it became a fact. On the last day of September, she was in the yard doing a final walkthrough before the weather turned, and she noticed that the small solar motion light at the corner of the shed had been unscrewed from its bracket. It was lying in the grass. The wires had not been cut. It had simply been removed and set on the ground as if someone had wanted her to know they had been there, and had wanted her to know they had chosen not to do more than they had done. She picked up the light. She screwed it back into its bracket. She did not tell her father. She did not tell Emmett. She stood in the yard as the sun was going down and looked at the row of hives, all 12 of them alive. All 12 of them heavy with winter stores. All 12 of them humming faintly against the cool evening. She thought about her father saying, "Don't give him what he wants." She thought about Emmett saying, "Patience with bees is patience with yourself." She thought about Silas DeWeiler saying, "My grandfather kept bees for his own bloom. He would have liked seeing this." She thought about her own voice, quiet, steady, saying yes when Silas had asked her the question that had changed the shape of everything. The first frost came the next morning. It was light. It burned off by 10. But it was the beginning of the season she had been preparing for since May, and she knew it. And she was ready in the way she had learned to be ready, which was not by being sure, but by being prepared for what she could not be sure of. She went into the equipment shed and pulled down the insulation wraps she had cut and stored on the top shelf in August. She began measuring them against the hive bodies one at a time, marking the ones that would need trimming to fit the smaller nooks she had started as backup colonies. The work took her the rest of the morning. She did not stop for lunch. When she finished, she stood back and looked at the row of 12 wrapped and tagged, ready for the last inspection, before she would close them for the winter. Delphine came out to the porch and called that her father wanted her in the kitchen. Hollis wiped her hands on the front of her jeans and walked up to the house. Warren was sitting at the kitchen table with a folded newspaper and a mug of coffee. He looked up when she came in. He said, "Sit down for a minute." She sat down. He said, "I've been thinking about the winter. I've been thinking about the contract with Silas. I've been thinking about the fact that a certain party in this valley has been driving past our property for the last 3 weeks, like a dog casing a garbage can." He said, "I want you to know something. I do not know how any of this is going to turn out. I have never known how any spring is going to turn out, and I have been farming this land for 31 years. But I want you to know that whatever comes, you are not going through it alone. Not this winter, not this spring, not whenever the next thing comes." He said it looking down at his mug, not at her. She understood that this was as close as her father was going to come to the kind of statement other fathers made easily and often. And she understood that in his own way, this was more than most fathers would have said. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. Just get through the winter." Then he opened the newspaper. She got up. She went back out to the yard. The sun was higher. The frost was gone. The bees were flying. She did not know what was coming. She was going to find out soon. The first hard freeze came on the second Tuesday of October, and Hollis went out to the yard before dawn to check the entrances one last time. She had done everything Emmett had told her to do. She had installed mouse guards on every hive because a coal box was an open invitation for rodents looking for a warm place to nest through winter. She had cut small upper entrances into every inner cover so trapped condensation could escape instead of dripping down onto the cluster below. She had weighed every hive by hand one final time. She had wrapped the boxes in black roofing paper to catch what little winter sun the north side would offer during the coldest weeks. She had done all of it, and none of it felt like enough. Emmett had warned her at the end of September that more colonies died over winter than at any other time of the year. Not from the cold itself, but from starvation and moisture. Bees did not hibernate. They clustered together in a tight ball at the center of the hive, vibrating their flight muscles to generate heat, slowly working their way through stored honey as the weeks passed. A hive with too little reserve, or one where condensation dripped down and chilled the cluster, could die quietly sometime in February without anyone knowing until it was too late. 12 hives. That was the number she had to hold through winter if the Deweiler contract was going to mean anything in the spring. She needed 8 of the strongest to move to the orchard by the first week of bloom, which meant she needed a margin of survival she could not manufacture, only wait for. She spent October and November in a rhythm that felt almost monastic. She checked the yard every 3 days. She brushed snow off the entrances after every storm. She listened at each hive with her ear pressed against the wood, waiting for the low, steady hum that meant the cluster was alive and holding position at the center of the box. Some mornings the sound was there immediately. Some mornings she had to stand for a full minute in the cold before she caught it, and each of those minutes was one of the longest of her life. The Deweiler contract came in late October. Silas drove into the yard on a gray afternoon with a folder under his arm, and he sat at the Renner kitchen table with Warren and Hollis and Delphine, and he laid the paperwork out in the same careful way he laid out everything without ceremony, without pressure. 8 hives for the spring bloom, standard commercial rate. A written agreement that could be renewed year to year without automatic renewal. Silas said, "I want you to read every line of that before you sign it. If you don't understand any part of it, we don't sign today." He said it looking at Hollis, not at Warren. He said, "This is your contract, not your father's. If it isn't right, we fix it." Hollis read every line. She asked one question about payment terms. Silas answered. She signed her name at the bottom in a hand that did not shake. That contract sat in a file folder in the kitchen desk drawer for the rest of the winter, and every time she opened the drawer for something else, she saw the edge of it, and she was reminded that she had made a promise she could not yet be sure she could keep. November brought the first heavy snow. She walked out to the yard in the pre-dawn dark with a headlamp and a soft bristled broom, and she cleared each entrance one at a time, careful not to knock the boxes hard enough to disturb the cluster inside. The bees did not fly. They would not fly again until the first warm afternoon in late February. She listened at each hive. All 12 were still humming. Emmett came by once a week through November. He did not go into the yard with her anymore. He sat on the porch with a mug of coffee her mother made him without asking, and he asked how the hive sounded, and she told him. He nodded. He did not offer new advice. She realized, slowly letting her carry the winter on her own, which was its own kind of teaching. The first weakness came in early December. She noticed it on a Wednesday morning during a routine ear check. The 5th hive down the row was quieter than the others. Not silent, but quieter the way a slow-running engine sounds different from one at proper idle. She pressed her ear closer. She waited. The hum came, but it was faint. She did not open the hive. Emmett had told her that opening a hive in winter for anything less than an emergency was almost always a mistake, that the cold air rushing in could break the cluster's heat before it recovered. She went home and called him. He listened. He asked her 3 questions. Was the entrance clear? Yes. Had she noticed any dead bees on the landing board out of proportion to the other hives? A few more than the others, she said. Not many. Was there any smell coming out of the entrance when she got close? No. Emmett said it's small. Might be a weaker cluster than the others. Might have started with a smaller population going into winter. You cannot fix it in December. You watch it. If the hum stops entirely, you tell me. If it comes back through Christmas, you leave it alone until February. She watched it. She stood in front of the 5th hive twice a week and listened. The hum stayed faint but constant. She did not open it. She did not disturb it. She let it fight its own fight, and every time she walked away from it, she made herself let it go. Christmas came. The valley was buried under 9 inches of snow. Delphine cooked a small dinner for the 3 of them, and Emmett came over because he had been coming over for Sunday dinners once a month since November, though nobody had ever formally invited him. Sawyer came by that afternoon to drop off a Christmas card and a small tin of cookies from his mother. Hollis showed him the yard from the porch. 12 hives buried to their bottom boards in snow. 12 small black shapes against the white, 12 quiet mysteries whose outcomes would not be known until March. Sawyer said, "You really are going to pull this off, aren't you?" Hollis said, "I don't know yet." He said, "I do." January was the hardest month. Not because anything specific happened, because nothing happened, and nothing was worse than something at that time of year. The cold settled in and did not lift. The sky stayed gray for 11 days in a row. The radio said wind chills of 20 below on the worst nights. Hollis walked out to the yard every morning anyway. She brushed snow. She listened. She heard hums, 12 of them, or 11 or 10, depending on the temperature and the wind. The 5th hive kept its quieter hum. It did not get quieter. It did not get louder. It simply held. The second solar motion light Hollis had installed after the first one had been unscrewed was disabled in the last week of January. She found it that way one morning. Not broken this time, just turned off at the base with a small screwdriver. The screwdriver had been left on the ground beneath it. It was a common brand. It could have belonged to anyone, but it had not belonged to her, and it had not been there the day before. She did not touch it. She looked at it. She left it. Then she went inside and told her father for the first time everything. The boot print in June, the light unscrewed in September, the light turned off in January. Warren listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you want me to call the sheriff?" Hollis said no. He said, "Why not?" She said, "Because if I make it a story now, it becomes a story. If I make it through until spring, and the bees do what I told Silas they would do, it becomes something else." She said, "I want it to be something else." Warren looked at her for a long time. He said, "All right." Then he said, "I am going to sleep with the porch light on until March. I am going to leave the truck parked where it can be seen from the road. I am not going to make a story either, but I am going to make it hard for the story to happen." He did what he said he would do. The porch light stayed on every night. The truck stayed parked with its nose toward the county road. Nothing else happened at the yard for the rest of January or February. February brought a strange warm spell. In the second week, 3 days of temperatures in the 50s, and Hollis went out to the yard on the second afternoon with her heart already in her throat. She had been waiting for this. The bees would break cluster on a day like this. They would take cleansing flights. They would fly out of the boxes for the first time in 3 months and empty their bodies of waste they had been holding since November. And by watching them do it, she would learn which of her hives were still alive. She stood at the end of the row. She waited. The first hive's bees came out at 11 in the morning. She counted them by the dozen at first, then by the 100, a slow, steady stream out of the entrance and into the pale February sun. The second hive followed, then the third, then the fourth. The fifth hive did not fly at 4th. The fifth hive did not fly at 11. It did not fly at noon. It did not fly by 1 in the afternoon. Hollis stood in front of it. She listened. She heard the hum, faint, steady, present. She waited. At 1:30, the first bee came out, then another, then a slow, weak stream, not the volume of the others, but a stream nonetheless. The colony was alive, weaker, but alive. She counted colonies as the afternoon wore on. All 12 flew, every single one. She sat down on the ground in front of the row and did not move for a while. Her hands were shaking. She did not know if it was the cold or the release. She only knew that she was going to make it. She was going to make it to spring with her margin intact, and Silas was going to get the 8 hives she had promised him, and the winter that had been trying to break her for 4 months had not broken her. She walked back to the house. Her mother was in the kitchen. Delphine looked up when she came in, took one look at her face and said they all made it. It was not a question. Hollis said all 12. Delphine put down the dish towel she was holding. She crossed the kitchen. She hugged her daughter, which she had not done in a way this specific in more than a year. And Hollis let herself be hugged, which she had not done in a way this specific either. Neither of them said anything. They stood there for a long time. March arrived on schedule. The snow began to melt. The first crocuses came up along the south wall of the house. Hollis started her spring inspections on the first genuinely warm afternoon of the month opening, each hive briefly checking for the queen or for evidence of her laying counting frames of brood, assessing the strength of each colony as it came out of winter. The fifth hive had lost more of its population than the others, but the queen was still alive. She was laying a small, tight pattern of eggs at the center of one frame. The colony would rebuild. It would not be one of the 8 she moved to Silas's orchard, but it would live to make honey by summer. The other 11 were in various stages of strength. 8 of them were strong. She marked those 8 with a small yellow chalk mark on the top of each lid, and those 8 became the Deweiler colonies. She moved them on the 15th of April, 3 days before the first apple bloom was expected to open. She drove her father's truck with the hive boxes strapped in the back entrances, screened shut for the drive, and she made 2 trips to the Deweiler orchard to move all 8. Silas was there for both trips. He did not help with the moving. He watched. He was the kind of man who watched a job to make sure it was done right, and if it was done right, he did not need to say so afterward. Hollis placed the hives at 4 spots around the orchard, 2 hives per stand, spaced to give the foragers overlapping coverage across the 60 acres of trees. She opened the entrance screens on the last hive at 4 in the afternoon. The bees came out immediately. They oriented themselves in slow spirals in front of the entrances, memorizing the position of the new location, then peeled off in every direction into the orchard. Silas stood next to her at the last stand. He said, "My grandfather always told me that the sound of bees in the orchard at bloom was the sound of the year turning." He said, "I have not heard it in 20 years." He did not say anything else. He turned and walked back to his truck. He drove away. The bloom came the following week. It came heavy that year, heavier than any bloom the valley had seen in a decade, according to the older men at the co-op. The trees turned white and pink from the road, and the air over the orchard was thick with the hum of Hollis's bees moving between the flowers. She drove past the orchard on the second day of bloom and pulled over on the shoulder just to listen. The sound carried across the county road. It was the sound of something she had made without knowing she was making it. Raymond Blackwood drove past her while she was pulled over. He slowed as he came alongside her truck. He looked at her through his window. He did not smile this time. He did not do anything. He accelerated and drove on. She watched him disappear around the bend. She got back in her truck. She drove home. 6 weeks later, on a warm afternoon at the end of May, Silas DeWeiler walked out into his orchard and stood in the middle of the eastern block and looked up. The trees above him were carrying young apples in numbers he had not seen since he was a boy. Some of the branches were already bowing under the weight of the developing fruit, and he knew, in the way an orchard man knows these things without measurement, that this was going to be the biggest crop his family had produced since his father's time. He drove to the Renner place that same afternoon. Hollis was in the yard working on a hive stand that had a loose leg. Silas parked his truck. He got out. He walked over to her. He stood for a moment before he spoke. He said, "I didn't think much of what you were doing with those old boxes." Hollis stood up. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She said, "I know." She said, "I wasn't always sure myself, honestly." Silas nodded slowly. He looked out over the shed full of hives that had once been headed for a burn pile. He said, "Well, glad somebody in this valley was paying attention." Then he stood there for another moment. He did not usually stand around after a conversation was over, but he stood there. He said, "I want to sign next year's contract before the fall. I want it locked in before anyone else has a chance to try to change my mind." He said, "I do not intend to have my mind changed, but I want it locked in." Hollis said, "All right." Silas nodded. He walked back to his truck. He drove away. She stood in the driveway for a long time after his truck was gone. Her father came out of the barn. He had been listening from inside. He did not say anything. He came over to her. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. He went back to what he had been doing. Word about the DeWeiler crop moved through the valley faster than any story about her had ever moved. By the middle of June, the Whitlock place was calling to ask about the following spring. The Aldrich family called. Mrs. Carraway called about her peach trees. 2 other small orchards Hollis had never been in touch with reached out through Mrs. Theolander at the school. The list she had been keeping on a legal pad in the kitchen filled up. She did not have enough hives to serve every request. She had to start telling people gently that the earliest she could reasonably work with them was the following spring after that, when she could split her colonies through a second summer of growth and have enough strong hives to spread across more properties. She sat at the kitchen table one night in late June with a legal pad in front of her working through the math. Her father sat across from her doing his own books. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Warren said, without looking up, "You are going to have to hire help." Hollis said, "I know." Warren said, "Sawyer's been asking his father about a summer job for 2 years now." Hollis said, "I know." Warren said, "You can afford to pay him if you're careful." Hollis said, "I know." Then she smiled briefly, and her father saw it, and he smiled at his ledger, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Blackwood's losses became public that same summer, though, not because he announced them. His largest melon-growing client dropped him at the end of June, citing poor coverage during bloom. 2 of his commercial hayfield leases were not renewed. His trucks were seen less often on the county road. The rumors he had been spreading about foul brood the previous summer had followed him back around, as rumors sometimes did, in a valley the size of Millbrook and Denton roads. From the Extension Office had made a quiet call to the state apiary program to note his concern about a private citizen making unfounded disease claims. Nothing formal came of it. Nothing needed to. The story had already done its work. Blackwood himself did not disappear. He was too established to disappear. But his voice in the valley grew smaller and his trucks grew fewer, and by the end of the following summer, his commercial operation had shrunk by nearly half. He did not come to the renter property again. He did not drive past. He did not send anyone. Whatever the two boot prints and the two disabled motion lights had been, they stopped, and Hollis never learned for certain who had left them. She did not need to know. That was the thing she understood later. She did not need to know who it had been. She needed to have built something the person could not damage more than they had damaged. And she had done that, and the damage they had done had turned out to be smaller than she had feared. The rest of that summer she spent building. She hired Sawyer part-time. She hired a younger boy from the Whitlock family named Cade for 2 afternoons a week to help with routine inspections and equipment maintenance. She built out the equipment shed with a small extraction room and a wash sink. She bought a used commercial-grade extractor from an auction in the next county over and installed it herself with Emmett watching from a folding chair, offering advice only when she asked for it. She began mapping out where she would place hives across the valley for the coming spring, sketching pollination routes and forage windows on a hand-drawn map that eventually covered most of one wall of her bedroom. She split colonies aggressively through July. By the end of the summer, she had gone from 12 to 23 hives, which was more than she had planned, but which the demand had made necessary. She held nothing back from Silas's contract. 8 of her strongest still had his name on them for the following spring, but she had built enough margin around that 8 to serve 4 more properties at reduced volumes and to keep 3 colonies purely for honey production without pollination duties. Harlan Petrie came by more often now. He would sit on a folding chair at the corner of the equipment shed while Hollis worked, and he would talk about his own beekeeping years in a way he had never talked about them before, not to teach exactly, but to remember. He told her one afternoon that he had not felt useful in 7 years since the arthritis had taken his hands. He said, "Watching what you're doing here, I feel useful again. Not because I'm doing anything, but because I'm here for it." Then he stopped talking. He did not want to say more than he had said. She did not ask him to. Emmett's corrections got smaller through that summer and less frequent. There was less to correct. He noticed one afternoon that she was requeening a colony without needing to think through the steps moving through the process with the fluency of a person who had done it enough times to trust her hands. And he said briefly, "Well." He said it in the same tone he had used the first time he had told her she had done a split, right briefly without inflection, as if he were reading a fact off a clipboard. She heard it. She did not comment. She wrote it in the notebook that night. The notebook itself had changed shape over the 2 years. The first one, the spiral-bound one she had started that April in her jacket pocket, was full. She had begun a second one that fall, then a third that summer, and by the end of her second year in the yard, she had 3 notebooks filled with observations, sketches, forage maps, weather logs, queen introduction, records, and small brief marginalia she wrote at the tops of pages when Emmett or Harlan said something worth keeping. At the top of one page in the second notebook in her own hand, she had written a line she had not attributed to anyone, but which had come from Emmett in the honey house one September afternoon. He had said, sitting on a stool watching her filter honey, most of what the valley writes off as worthless. Just needed someone willing to look closer and ask why, instead of assuming they already knew. He had not been trying to say something quotable. He had been trying to explain why he was still bothering to keep 3 nukes at his own house at 75. But she had heard it, and she had written it, and she went back to that page more than she went back to any other in any of the 3 books. By the following April, the 3rd April of her operation, she had 30 hives. She placed 8 in the Dweiler orchard for a second bloom, and this time Silas did not stand around and watch. He shook her hand at the gate, walked back to his house, and let her work. She placed 4 hives at the Whitlock property. She placed 4 at Mrs. Carraway's peach stand. She placed 2 at each of 3 smaller properties that had contacted her the summer before. She placed 6 along the tree line at the far edge of the Renner property purely for honey production. The Dweiler orchard bloomed heavy that spring. Not quite as heavy as the year before because 2 years of the same yield was not how orchards worked, but heavy enough that Silas told her at the fall settlement that he had cleared more revenue from fruit in 2 seasons than he had cleared in the previous 8 combined. He said it flatly without any expression of gratitude because he was not the kind of man who thanked people for doing what they had contracted to do, but he added at the end that he intended to sign the contract for a 3rd year at the same rate, and that if she ever needed anything from him, she should ask because he owed her a debt that a contract did not quite cover. Then he said, "My grandfather would have liked this." He said it looking out at the orchard from the porch of his house, and she was not sure whether he was speaking to her or to himself. But she took the words and she carried them home, and she wrote them in the third notebook. That summer, the summer after her second full year, was the summer things settled into a rhythm she recognized as something like a life. She worked the yard in the mornings. She kept the books at the kitchen table in the evenings. She trained Sawyer to run inspections on his own so she could focus on the more delicate work of queen assessments and disease scans. She sent honey to 3 grocery stores in 2 counties, small volume, high margin, all with her hand-lettered label. She began attending the State Beekeepers Association meetings twice a year. She met keepers from other counties who had heard about her yard through Denton roads and who came up to introduce themselves at the coffee break and ask her questions she had not expected to be able to answer, but which she found she could answer. She did not think of herself as an expert. She did not think of herself as anything in particular. She thought of herself as someone who kept bees and who was still learning and who happened to have started her learning during a moment in her life when almost nothing else made sense to her. At home, her father had stopped calling it the bee business or the yard or anything specific. He called it what she did, which was the highest thing he called any kind of work. Delphine had begun keeping the books for her at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, alongside the family ledgers, and she did it without comment in the same handwriting she used for the church directory. Bertram had not come by the house in more than a year. Nobody in the family mentioned him. He was not gone exactly. He was simply no longer relevant to what the Renner property had become. Emmett was in his kitchen more than he was on his porch now. His hands had gotten worse over the second winter. He could no longer hold the smoker for more than a minute at a time. He no longer came out to the yard at all. Hollis brought him a small jar of honey from every harvest, and he set them on a windowsill in his kitchen, where the light caught them 10 or 11 jars in a row by the end of that summer. He watched the light through them in the mornings while he drank his coffee. She sat with him one afternoon in late August. She had brought him a jar from the summer basswood flow. He held it in his hand for a moment before he set it on the windowsill. He said, "I have been at this long enough to know that most of what a beekeeper leaves behind is not the honey." Then he said, "Most of what a beekeeper leaves behind is what the land looks like after they have been on it." Then he said, "Your land is going to look different for a long time because of what you did." She did not answer right away. She looked at the jars on the windowsill. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. I didn't do it." Then he looked at her for a long moment, the way he had looked at her that first Saturday on his doorstep when she had shown up with her notebook and her question about resurrecting dead colonies. He said, "You did." She drove home that afternoon slower than she needed to. She did not turn on the radio. She let the road pass beneath her without hurry. When she pulled into the Renner driveway, the light was low across the yard, and 30 hives were humming along the south wall of the equipment shed and out along the tree line, and her father was standing on the porch watching her come in. He raised a hand. She raised hers back. The third spring of her operation opened on a warm morning in early April, 3 days earlier than the year before. The apple bloom in the Deweiler orchard began that same week. Hollis stood at the edge of the eastern block on the second day of bloom, and she listened to the hum of her bees rising off the 60 acres of white and pink flowers, and she watched the sun catch the surface of the trees in a way that made the whole orchard look like it was breathing. Silas was at the far corner of the block on his own tractor. He did not come over. He did not need to. They had done this now. This was the third year of it. The exact shape of what she had built was still becoming clear to her, but the fact of it was no longer in question. Some of the older men in the valley had started to stop her at the co-op counter and ask her questions about their own struggling operations. They asked in a particular tone, the tone of men who had not expected to be asking a girl in her early 20s for advice about their farms, but who had run out of other options. She answered their questions the way Emmett had once answered hers, patiently, without making them feel worse than they already did, without pretending she knew things she did not know. Once in the parking lot of the feed store, a man she did not recognize walked up to her and shook her hand. He told her his name. She did not recognize it either. He said he had a small orchard on the far side of the county, 12 trees, nothing commercial, only what his grandfather had planted before the war. He said his crop had failed for 4 years running. He asked if she had any advice for a man who could not afford a pollination contract, but who did not want to see the trees die on his watch. Hollis stood with him in the parking lot for 20 minutes. She told him about wild pollinator habitat. She told him about the value of not spraying his neighbor's fence line. She told him about the small things a person could do at almost no cost to encourage the native bees that had once lived in the hedgerows before the hedgerows had been cleared. She wrote her number on the back of his receipt. She told him to call if he had more questions. He called the following week. She talked with him for another half hour. He would call again in June. He would call again in September. He would call every summer for the next 4 years, and each year the trees would carry a little more fruit, and each year the man would tell her briefly that his grandfather would have liked to see it. She did not know that yet, driving home from the feed store that afternoon. She only knew that the sun was warm and the hives were humming, and the notebook in her jacket pocket now had 4 years of notes in place of the handful of sketches it had held the day she had first walked up the flagstone path to Emmett Iverson's front door. She pulled into the Renner driveway. She got out of the truck. She walked to the row of hives along the south wall of the equipment shed. She stood in front of the third hive, the one Silas had been looking at when he had first come into the yard 3 summers ago, and she put her hand flat against the side of the box just below the entrance. The wood was warm. She could feel the vibration of thousands of wings through her palm. She stood that way for a long time. Across the valley, the apple trees were still in bloom. The hum was in the air everywhere. A few of the people in the valley remembered exactly why they used to doubt her and exactly why they didn't anymore. She went inside for dinner. The notebook stayed in her jacket pocket where it always was. The bees kept humming. The valley kept turning.